Wow, if I could just sort of summon the ghosts of the people who've stood here, it's a spine-tingling place for a scientist, especially a scientist with a keen interest in history. So thanks to the Royal Institution for having me. And thanks to all of you folks for coming out on a Wednesday night to hear about science. And kids, we're going to see some animals. I might even ask you a couple of questions, so be on your toes, okay? All right. So I am going to talk about the Serengeti rules. We're going to get out on the Serengeti in a couple of minutes, but I want to give you some context. It was the summer of 2014. I had just finished work on a film for the Smithsonian Channel in the US on mass extinction. And in addition to getting to know some of the geologists that had studied major events in the past, I got to know several ecologists and went around parts of the world with them. And I began to appreciate that even some highly protected places, like say Yellowstone National Park in the United States, were starting to show some issues. And if I thought began to worry if some of the most protected places were having problems, what was that going to say about the rest of the world? And like you, I saw headlines like this one, talking about what had happened to the world's wildlife over the last 40 to 50 years, and other headlines about, for example, paving a highway right through the middle of the Serengeti, the World Heritage Site in Tanzania. And I thought, well, two things. I'd never been to the Serengeti, despite a lifelong dream of going there. So I thought it was probably better be time to go. And I thought if I was going to go, I should take my family. So I did. 6 of us shared a vehicle for a couple of weeks. And when I went, I really went with a combination of excitement that I was going to go to a place that I had always dreamt of going, but a little bit of anxiety from those headlines. What would I find when I got there? So I spent just a few minutes to show you what we found when we got there. This is, we're just posing outside the Serengeti entrance gate. I think the first thing that surprised me was that was the entrance gate. That's it. One of the great wildernesses of the world. Welcome. From looking over sort of the rooftop of the vehicle, you can see it's a gravel road going into this grassland. The grass is maybe at this stage, this is late June, not quite maybe knee high, but you can see it's fairly brown. And as we drove in, I started getting a little bit worried because we're looking left and we're looking around, we're looking on the horizon, and we do spot, hopefully you can see her there. We see a lioness, but all we can see is her back against that grass. And I'm thinking, we're in trouble here. I'm the only biologist in my clan, and they're not going to want to do this for days on end if that's what we're going to see of wildlife. But we drove further in, and we started to see little streaks of green, then a few acacia trees, and came up over a bend. And then this is what we encountered, just little footage. These are home movies. We wound up being just surrounded by zebra, a couple thousand, stripes in all directions, a couple thousand zebra. There was a water hole there that they had come down to swim in and to drink from. And then on the horizon, a troop of elephants coming down to that same water hole. And so here we were, just this magnificent 360-degree view. And from that moment on, I had no worries about the Serengeti because it offered up an unending canvas of animals of all sizes and shapes and colors, from sturdy warthogs to lounging hippos, which they're particularly good at, sleek impala, majestic giraffes. My wife and I were so enchanted with giraffes, I made them stop the vehicle every time we came upon a giraffe, which was probably a couple hundred stops over a week. Never got tired of looking at them. And then on one of our last days, this beauty shared a private evening and morning with us while she dined on a gazelle that she had stuffed up in a tree. So it was more than I expected. I thought I had really been prepared from everything I had read or TV shows I had seen, but it really topped my expectations. And as I sort of gazed out over this landscape and all this wildlife over the first few days, a bit of an unsettling thought occurred to me, which was, I was awestruck, but I didn't understand what I was looking at. I'm a professional biologist. I didn't understand why or how the Serengeti was the way it was. And that's a bit embarrassing for me because I've actually spent my entire career, as Clive mentioned, studying animals and actually studying how they form, even studying how they get stripes and spots. But I've been doing that mostly through a microscope and seeing sort of the invisible things that happen inside animals that build their bodies and build their body parts and build different kinds of animals, mostly small creatures like butterflies and things like that. So what really had me stumped were the numbers of animals. I've been fortunate to be to really nice, interesting places in the world on many continents, but I was just floored by the number of animals that I was looking at on the Serengeti. I didn't know why there would be different numbers of animals whatsoever. But I did, because I've studied biology a long time. I know a few things about what at least goes on inside animal bodies. And one thing I did know is that, they're inside animal bodies, there's lots of reactions going on, lots of processes going on. So I began to think about, well, what do we know about the internal world of animals, and could that possibly explain what we know about the external world of animals? So I didn't know why there were so many wildebeest on the Serengeti. I didn't know why there were so few topi that are virtually about the same size. But what I did know was that all the substances in animal bodies and in our bodies are regulated. The amount of everything. Fats like cholesterol, salts like calcium, hormones like estrogen, enzymes that digest our food, all maintained in particular ranges and in different ranges over many, many, many different orders of magnitude. And that generally even the number of cells in our body are maintained. Red cells, white cells, kidney cells, gut cells, etc. They're maintained in a particular range. And that one of the major quests of biology over the last 50, 60 years, particularly the tribe I belong to, so-called molecular biologists, has been to look at these processes and understand what I'll call the rules of regulation. To really understand how life works, how we are the way we are, we need to understand the rules that, for example, regulate our bodies. Now, how have scientists been doing this? Well, we've generally been doing it by trying to find, to use some sports terms, sort of the key players in any particular process. In this case, molecules that regulate a process. And once we have identified those key players, we sort of see how do they play with other things? How do they play with other molecules, for example, and figure out those rules that govern their play. And that knowledge has been tremendous power. Because by understanding precisely what regulates processes in our human body, that has guided all sorts of advances in medicine. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say a revolution in medicine. Because that knowledge allows us, when these things fall out of whack, when regulation is somehow awry, and really most diseases that I can think of or that you can think of are really problems with regulation, where too much or too little of something is being produced. I'll give you a couple familiar examples. And we use drugs to restore things that are missing or reduced, or to fix sort of broken links in these regulatory processes. We give insulin to diabetics, shown up here in the upper left, a component that's missing that or reduced that we need to replace. In other cases, we exploit the logic of, for example, how cholesterol is regulated in our bodies, and that's what the whole class of drugs known as statins do. All the Lipitors, Mevacors, et cetera, that have reached the market in the last 30 years and have had a dramatic effect on cardiac medicine. Vastly reduced the incidence of heart attacks and strokes and the death rate due to cardiac events. So we've learned an awful lot about how regulation works. And in the new book, I tell the stories of some of the pioneers who figured out these rules of regulation in the human body. But the central question that I want to focus on in my talk tonight is about life on a larger scale. Not about the number of molecules or cells, but really the number of animal bodies. And the question I want to ask is, how are the numbers of animals and plants regulated out there in nature? I want to even ask the question, are there rules that govern life at larger scales? Well, as it turns out, if there weren't, we wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have a book, and you'd have the night off, okay? So this is what we're going to explore. So for most of the talk, I'm going to talk about some of the pioneers who've gone out into the world and asked this question. I think largely stories that are unknown, people that are unknown, but they're enormously important figures in biology. And then in the last part of my talk, in the same way that we've used this knowledge of the rules of regulation in the body to improve medicine, how can we use the rules we learn about how nature works on a larger scale to preserve or even cure ailing ecosystems? So to start this adventure, I want to give you a little history of the Serengeti that I thought you might enjoy. To put in perspective, the Serengeti it went through various stages in the development as a national park, but tourism was not a big deal through the first half of the 20th century. And some of the first people to go into the Serengeti and really take a serious look around were biologists. And one of the first things they wanted to do and confronted, you can imagine with all that wildlife, scientists count things, right? How many things are here? So what did they do? Well, I'm going to show you clips from a film about the first aerial survey of wildlife in the Serengeti, so you can see how this was done in 1958 by two German zoologists, Bernard and Michael Jimmick. And this is a clip that's going to show a little bit of their methodology. So there's Bernard on the left and his son Michael on the right, and they're plotting their course in their fancy airplane. Pretty cool looking plane. And they and two other spotters are going to climb into this plane, generally with the doors open, so they have a nice clear view, and take off and fly low and slow over the Serengeti. And here's complex computer graphics in films of the 1950s showing you their path. Back and forth, back and forth. Okay, so what's that look like? Let's go counting with the Jimmicks. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's exactly what they're doing. At about 120 miles an hour, they're counting all the wildebeest in this picture. Okay, and as you can see, the wildebeest are not standing still. So they did this day after day in this grid pattern, but they're not just counting wildebeest, they're counting all the large mammals they can see and count by eye from whatever altitude that they feel safe to fly at, which is pretty low. So what did they come up with? So this is the results of their survey, January 1958. They came up with 99,481 wildebeest, okay? Not 482, not 480. 57,199 zebra, okay? And with further sort of Teutonic precision, 5,000 or so topi, 1,800 buffalo, just 60 elephants. So elephants were pretty scarce in those days, still sort of a leftover, a hangover effect of the ivory trade in earlier decades. But in total, 366,000 large mammals. Now they admitted, they said they might have missed, maybe 10,000 out at the edges. But they thought this was a pretty accurate survey. They tried really hard to get the numbers right. They wrote a book of the same name as their movie, Serengeti Shall Not Die. And they wondered aloud, were there enough plains and mountains and river valleys and bush areas to maintain these last giant herds still in existence? They were worried that the number of wildlife was so astonishing to them. Did the Serengeti really have enough space, enough food, enough water for all of these animals? Well, really, within a few years, an answer to that question would start to materialize. And it wasn't the answer that the Jimmicks either expected or you might think feared. Okay? And those answers started to materialize when a young student from Oxford University named Tony Sinclair went as an undergraduate, still in his undergraduate years, to the Serengeti. Now he went with Oxford faculty. The purpose was primarily to study birds, but they quickly drafted him into the aerial survey going on that year. And in the course of that aerial survey, Tony and the others conducting the survey turned up a mystery. And the mystery concerned the number of buffalo. In 1961, several years earlier, they'd counted 16,000 buffalo in the Serengeti. But that number had somehow jumped in 1965 to 37,000. What's going on with the buffalo? So scientists said to Tony, who was now interested that maybe he could do his doctoral work on the Serengeti, would you like to study the buffalo? And he said, sure. He was enchanted with the Serengeti. He thought it would be a great question to pursue. So over the next dozen years or so, first triggered by the buffalo, Tony focused all of his research on the Serengeti. And he addressed a few general questions. And here's Tony, by the way, with a buffalo. Kids, I think that's a tranquilized buffalo, or else that's really not the way to study buffalo in the Serengeti. That's a little too close. He looks like he's being a little cautious, but that's way too close. Okay. So what he wanted to ask was, why were the buffalo increasing, if indeed they were increasing? And then really, what explained the great differences in the number of different kinds of animals? Why were there so many of one kind and fewer of another? Why were there so many of any kind? And really what was in Tony's heart was to wanting to know, why is the Serengeti the way it is? Because it was such an amazing spectacle of this great diversity of wildlife, these giant herds, the only place like it left on the planet. So he tackled this buffalo mystery first by continuing the aerial surveys to see how many buffalo were in the Serengeti. And he confirmed that the buffalo population was growing. In fact, it kept growing from 16,000 in 1961, 37,000 in that first survey he participated in, then into the 50,000s over in the next few years. So the population was growing. So that was a mystery. Why, if you might think sort of all of a sudden, were there more buffalo in the Serengeti? So, all right, so I see some youngsters probably taking science classes right now, so I'm going to give you a shot at this. Why might there be more buffalo in the Serengeti? Give me one idea. Fire away.
Because they're bigger and they could have killed the other animals.
You think the buffalo might have killed off other animals?
Yeah, and reproduced more.
Well, they certainly did reproduce more, so that's a really important thought. That's one possibility. And what about another?
Were there less people going after them?
Great. Maybe they weren't being hunted. Maybe they were better protected. Another good idea. Any other ideas? Okay. So this is what. Oh yeah, fire away right here in front. Sorry, missed you.
Maybe they migrated from somewhere else.
Might have come in from somewhere else. Yep.
They didn't really have as many predators.
Great. Look at that. 4 hypotheses right there. Oh, sorry, can't see. I'm blinded by the light, so thank you for that help. I can barely see past the front rows. There you go. Where's another hand? Center? In the gallery. Oh, just shout it down. I can't see you. Another idea?
Maybe their natural predators are being hunted by illegal poachers.
Right.
So with less predators to
Right.
eat them, the buffalo population was having an extreme growth.
Great. So logical possibilities. That's what you all gave me right there. Logical possibilities, something could be going on. So let me show you the logic that Tony Sinclair worked through. He thought he had to answer a really basic question, which was maybe there were more buffalo because there was more food. Right? Wouldn't that give you more buffalo too, if there was just more food? But looking through the Serengeti, he had been flying over it year after year. It seemed like, the buffalo liked these sort of woodland, grassland sort of areas. It seemed like the grass was growing. There seemed to be as much food as any time before. So he thought, no, that's probably not the answer. Now, he did think of what a couple of you folks brought up. He thought maybe there's fewer predators, for whichever reason. Either a natural cause or maybe because humans were taking them out. But as it turns out, 2 things that Tony observed. First of all, most buffalo didn't die from predators. Okay? So that wasn't very common that buffalo would be taken down. Most buffalo, when they died of something else. And secondly, counts were going on of predators. And for example, lions are the only things big enough to take down buffalo. And lions were not only fewer, they were actually increasing in this time. So we had to eliminate that possibility. And this is exactly the way scientists work. Think of all the possibilities and start to work your way through them and either rule them in or rule them out, see what you can do to exclude them. So he then thought there was another possibility, which none of you brought up and I didn't think of either when I first read this story. And that is the possibility of disease. That another thing that affects wild populations just like us are diseases that can either reduce the ability to have babies or obviously cause death. And Tony knew that wildlife got a lot of diseases, buffalo got a lot of diseases, but there was one disease in particular that he was suspicious of. And that was a disease called cattle plague, or the German name Rinderpest. And it was well known in East Africa and well known in the Serengeti because many times in the previous 70 or 80 years, it had swept through the Serengeti. Now here's an important thing to think about. It hit three different kinds of animals. The cattle that were being grazed by humans, especially by the pastoral people, buffalo, and wildebeest, but not other animals. And it was thought that the buffalo and the wildebeest, the wild animals, were the reservoir for the virus, meaning the virus was hiding out in the wild population and that the humans, livestock, human cows, were getting sick from the wildlife. Well, a vaccine became available in the early 1960s, and a vaccination program was launched in East Africa. And Tony thought, maybe that vaccination program has had, even though it's just cattle being vaccinated, maybe that's had some spillover benefit to the buffalo. Now, how do we check this out? Well, if an animal or you or I is exposed to a virus, our immune systems make something called antibodies that can be measured in our bloodstream. So Tony got blood samples from buffalo, age matched them to the buffalo populations, and said, okay, is something going on with the exposure of buffalo to virus in the Serengeti? And the answer is his first eureka moment. Something really big was going on. That while an older buffalo had almost 100% exposure rate to this virus, buffalo born after 1964 showed no exposure to the virus whatsoever. So now he had a good suspect that this virus, which could cause massive mortality, massive death on the Serengeti of buffalo, was disappearing from the Serengeti. We also learned something else, which was that was because of vaccination of cows. So actually people had it upside down. The virus wasn't in the wildlife. The virus was in the cows. So when you vaccinated the cows, the buffalo didn't get sick. Okay? Now, he knew that the other animal that got sick from this virus was wildebeest. And he started paying attention to the wildebeest. So if the buffalo were booming because this virus had been eradicated, well, then wouldn't the same thing be true of wildebeest, right? If the buffalo were benefiting from getting rid of this virus, wouldn't the wildebeest be benefiting? Well, here are the numbers that Tony got for wildebeest over the years. That's a lot of wildebeest. He almost couldn't believe it himself. In the 1977 survey, they calculated 1.4 million wildebeest, okay? Huge number over the 1960s. So before we get into the explanation of why that is, just imagine the reaction of the Jimicks who were worried that maybe the Serengeti didn't have enough food and space for all those animals. There's now a million plus more wildebeest alone in the Serengeti by 1977. There was plenty of capacity in the Serengeti. What was happening was that virus must have been keeping that population down. Now, to confirm his suspicion, he still did the right experiments, which was to get blood samples from those wildebeest of various ages and see about the exposure to rinderpest. Saw the very similar pattern to the buffalo. In fact, no wildebeest born after 1963 had exposure to the virus. So he had his explanation. Why were the buffalo and the wildebeest booming in the Serengeti? It's because a virus had been keeping them down. Now, since he was studying the Serengeti so intensively, as were several other scientists, they were noticing other changes taking place in the Serengeti over this time. So I'm going to give you 3 observations, and we're going to see whether or not we can kind of connect the dots and figure out what's going on in the Serengeti. So we know we've got more buffalo, we know we got more wildebeest. Well, one other thing that was noticed was that there was less fire in the Serengeti. If you looked compared to the early 1960s versus the early 1970s, a lot less of the park was burning, and those fires were less intense. So those are percentage of burn areas, and you can see easily cut in half across the park, and more dramatically so in certain regions of the park. So the Serengeti burns every year. It's a natural phenomenon, but the fires were covering less area, and they were less in intensity. Okay, so less fire. What else was going on? Well, in certain parts of the park, the census revealed there were more giraffes. Okay, twice as many giraffes in 1976 than 1971. Okay, keep that in mind. What else could they see going on in the Serengeti? Well, it took a little longer to see the pattern, but I'm going to show you a photograph taken from the same point in the Serengeti over 30 years. And what it reveals is more trees. First photograph's taken on a shady day, so you have to sort of pick out the acacia trees there in the foreground. But as you move to 1986, there are more trees, 1991 more, and then this is all filled in by 2011. Now, early on in the early 1980s, they could tell there were more young trees. You're looking at really mature trees here in the picture here on the lower right. So for some reason, more trees were growing in the Serengeti. So let's see whether or not we can figure out that reason and connect it with the other observations I gave you. So what's happened on the Serengeti? Well, first, we got rid of this virus. That led to more wildebeest. What do wildebeest do? They eat grass. And when they eat that grass, they actually mow it down from about 30 centimeters to about 10 centimeters high. And so that means there's going to be less and shorter grass left over when the Serengeti are done grazing. That grass is the fuel for the fires in the Serengeti. So with less fuel, you're going to have less frequent and less intense fires. Now, what does fire do on the Serengeti? Well, one thing that fire does on the Serengeti is it burns up young trees. So with less fire, there are now more trees. Well, what's the effect of more trees? Well, if you happen to like grazing the tops of acacia trees like giraffes, you've got more food. So this change in the Serengeti, this elimination of this virus, set in motion this whole sequence of events where more wildebeest mowed down the grass, reduced the number of fires. There was now more tree cover, more giraffes for feeding, and a lot more effects because, for example, that greater tree cover means there's more places for birds to nest. There's actually also more cover for the predators. So these changes have many effects on other kinds of creatures. So what Tony became to appreciate is that, and this may be contrary to what you've seen on TV. I sort of imagine if you see a film about the African savannah, within the first 2 minutes, you're going to see a cat chasing a gazelle or a zebra. Am I right? Okay. Is that what makes the Serengeti the way it is? No. What Tony Sinclair would say, what makes the Serengeti the way it is a million lawnmowers. It's 1 million wildebeest just chewing grass, and they move in a 600-mile circuit around the Serengeti in the course of a year. And by chewing that grass down, they have changed the habitat for so many other creatures. Shorter grass not only means there's less fire, but that shorter grass creates better habitat, as it turns out, for butterflies. The more trees, as I told you, is better for the bird life. Greater diversity of birds, more cover for predators. It's the wildebeest mowing the Serengeti that make the Serengeti the way it is. And a little later, we'll ask you whether you think they should put a paved highway through the migration route. So scientists, ecologists have a term for an animal that has such an important influence on the whole community to which it belongs. And that's my first Serengeti rule of the night. I'm going to give you 4. And the first rule borrows a little bit from George Orwell. But for a long time, biologists sort of looked at a community and sort of thought that, well, everybody was a component and sort of everything was equal. Well, some animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others, okay? And we call these keystone species. Keystone species, they regulate community diversity. They have a disproportionate effect on the diversity of creatures that live in a given place. The name comes from, not from the Serengeti. This was discovered somewhere else, not by Tony Sinclair. In fact, in a really different system. It was discovered by Bob Payne, an ecologist working off the coast of Washington in the USA, looking at starfish and the communities they belong to. And what Bob Payne found was that the starfish were keystones in that community. The idea he came up with in this little kind of manic diagram on the right is that if this species removed, and he did the experiment of removing starfish, the whole community collapsed. Just like if you remove the keystone from a Roman arch, the arch collapses. So he said, so some species are much more important than others at holding together a community, at the diversity of the community. And he even did the experiments of removing other things in the community and showing that they didn't have any major effect. So wildebeest are a keystone species. And Bob Payne, the same ecologist, again, working off in tide pools on the Pacific Ocean, coined another word to describe the phenomenon I described for you, where one species has this sort of chain reaction effect through the whole ecosystem. Now, if you think about food chains, we describe a lot of the way the world works is a series of food chains where plants provide the food for animals that graze on plants, and then those animals provide the food for predators like lions and things like this. And that when we describe each level of the food chain, we call it a trophic level. And what Bob Payne described this sort of chain reaction as a trophic cascade, A series of indirect effects rippling out from one particular species having a big impact on the rest of the community. And that quickly gets us to our Serengeti rule number 2. So you're almost halfway home, all right? And that is that some species have really strong indirect effects on other species through trophic cascades. This was incredibly surprising to scientists, that wildebeest would affect the number of giraffes, right? Who would suspect such a thing? And there's some other examples I'll give you before I finish tonight. Okay, so we've learned a little bit about what makes the Serengeti the way it is, but you might be wondering, what controls the wildebeest? Did they just keep right on growing without that virus around? Well, the answer is no. If they kept right on growing, then basically East Africa would be a carpet of wildebeest, and they'd probably be spilling out into the ocean. So wildebeest are regulated too. And what actually happened was that 1977, that 1.4 million wildebeest was the peak year for wildebeest. They leveled off at about 1 million, a lower number, okay? And here's a curve. So what's plotted on the left is how many wildebeest there are in different years. And you'll notice a really steep growth of the wildebeest, as I'm telling you about, up through about 1977. And then they kind of declined a bit, kind of overshot the mark, really. Now, I want to explain this pattern to you, but in general, as I ask the question about what regulates the wildebeest, again, kids, now that what you've heard about buffalo, you could come up with these possibilities. The wildebeest could be regulated by the amount of food that's around, or they could be regulated by who's eating them, right? And we call that bottom up from food or top down from predators regulation. So think of a food chain like a pyramid. Here the wildebeest are in the middle of the pyramid. They're eating plants, they're eating grass, but they are, to some degree, taken by predators. So what controls the number of wildebeest? Are they kept in check by predators, or are they limited by food? And before I tell you the answer to the wildebeest, I thought it'd be interesting for you to know, in general, what's going on in the Serengeti with other animals, because I think it will help you, as it helped me, understand the Serengeti as I looked at it. So you've got this possibility of top-down and bottom-up regulation. So which Serengeti mammals are regulated in which way? Think of those storybook creatures that live on the Serengeti. What do we know about how they're regulated? Well, what we know comes from work by Tony Sinclair, Simon Mduma, Justin Brashears, and collaborators over a long period of time of observing what Serengeti animals die from, okay? So here's a graph. You know, you might be thinking, oh, okay, but just study it, because it's one of the most informative little graphs I've enjoyed in a long time. So on the left, they're mapping the percent of animals that die from predation as a cause of mortality. And on the right, the body size of the animals. And look at the relationship. These are the smaller Serengeti mammals, the oribi being the smallest. Look at that death rate from predation, 100%. Okay, I sometimes imagine, you know, what does an oribi parent tell their young oribi about their future? Okay, kind of fill that in. All right, but look at the other end of the spectrum here. Elephants, hippopotamus, rhinoceros, generally giraffes, essentially zero predation. It happens, but it's so occasional, it makes no dent in the population. And look at the relationship to body size. These big animals are so big, they've escaped the power of predators. So now for everyone, I think you may have to be under 50 to sort of get this comparison, but I would describe this. This is the James Dean live fast, die young lifestyle, okay? And this is the more Marlon Brando eat all you can kind of lifestyle out here on the right. And what's going on here is that, of course, these animals, yes, they suffer a lot of predation, but generally they do reproduce rapidly. Okay, so they're keeping their numbers up by reproducing rapidly. They're small body size, so they have lower requirements for food, and they can reproduce more rapidly. These animals, really large, they reproduce slowly. It takes a long time to get to sexual maturity. Gestation time, as you know, in the elephants, the longest of any land mammal. So this is a different lifestyle. It says, okay, I'm going to escape predation, but I'm really dependent upon food supply. I need massive amounts of food every day. Okay? And there are some animals sort of in the middle. So where does the wildebeest land? And careful observation shows that, in fact, the wildebeest are regulated by food. It's the food supply that has the greatest effect. Yes, some die from predation, but that's not the major effect. The major effect has to do with the amount of food that's around. Okay? And this is our third Serengeti rule. Many animals show this food-regulated pattern, this density-regulated pattern. Okay, so the regulation of a good number of species depends upon their density, if you're food regulated. And that's true of buffalo, which don't generally die of much of predation. It's true of elephants, okay? They're limited by their density, by the amount of food that's available in this sort of way. In fact, elephants, if there's a bad season, a dry season, there's not a lot of food, there's even a feedback in the elephants hormonally that suppresses reproduction so that they don't have babies born under bad conditions, okay? All right. So why have I told you this all about the Serengeti? All of these rules, keystone species, trophic cascades, density regulation, all of these rules were discovered somewhere else first. I just thought it would be most enlightening, easiest to grasp if I told you in terms of what's going on in the Serengeti in terms of these storybook animals. But I've also told you these rules and dubbed them sort of the Serengeti rules because really almost every habitat in the world is the Serengeti. From the tiniest little plant to the greatest forest to the deep ocean, okay? And because every place is a Serengeti with predators, with things that eat plants, with the plants themselves, then these rules matter in each place. And if we're going to intervene in ecosystems, intervene in places, we really need to know the rules of regulation, just as we need to know the rules of regulation in the human body. We need to know the key players in any community, those species that regulate community structure. We need to understand the rules that govern their play. Who eats whom? Are there trophic cascades operating? And then if there's a problem, we need to figure out what it might take to either replace what is missing or fix broken links in that ecosystem. So let me, in the last part of my talk, illustrate for you in about 3 examples, sort of putting these rules into practice. So I told you even a tiny blade of rice could be a Serengeti. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. So here's a rice plant with a little insect called a plant hopper on it. And I'm only going to show you this part of sort of the food chain, which is these plant hoppers feed on these rice plants. Now you can imagine if you're a rice farmer and your livelihood or your family's food security depends upon having rice plants, this presence of this bug might concern you. And over the years, you know, the habit might have developed that if you see these bugs, you might want to hit them with pesticide. But in the early to mid-1970s, some farmers, particularly in Indonesia, noticed a strange phenomenon when they hit their fields with pesticide. The plant hoppers could go up 800-fold. That's not a good thing, okay? They devastate the rice plants. They cause this phenomenon called hopper burn. So you see a lot more plant hoppers in the rice, and you see this sort of brownout in the field where essentially the plants have been sucked dry by the plant hoppers. Now, how could this happen? You give a pesticide, and the number of bugs goes up. Now you'd think, if the bugs were resistant to the pesticide, they would just shrug it off. And in fact, that's what happened. The bugs evolved resistance to the pesticide, so it didn't affect them. But why would the numbers go up? Well, it took a little deeper investigation to think about why they might go up. If anybody wants to take a guess why they might go up and shout it out, go ahead.
They might, because they'd be scared of it, and they'd be hiding, and then they grow bigger numbers.
They go bigger in numbers because they'd be scared of the pesticide?
And
Yeah.
They wouldn't go near, or they wouldn't have.
So they'd avoid things. They'd try to get out of the way. So you think they're clever. Clever plant hoppers avoid the pesticide. I like that. Yeah.
Maybe the rice is good for them, so the pesticide doesn't.
That's right. They got plenty of food. Look at that field, right? All the rice you can eat, okay? Restaurants open all day long. You're right. Go ahead.
Maybe it removed something, the thing that was killing the plant hoppers, so then they could grow faster.
I don't know if you give high fives over here, but we're going to give you right there. We're going to go right to that. Even if it's an answer other people were holding, that's right on the nose. Again, different possibilities. What's happening? Well, it turns out spiders prey on plant hoppers, and a few other things do as well. And what happens is the pesticide kills the spiders, which are not resistant. And without those spiders, the plant hoppers go crazy. And if you change your habits and don't spray the moment you see some plant hoppers, it turns out the fields do much better. So the practice of pest management has changed completely in these rice fields, away from bombarding with pesticides and more towards trying to have natural enemies around. And that means planting your fields differently, planting some other plants around that give a hideout for things like spiders, or planting some of those plants amongst your your rice, so that there's some population of spiders and other things around to control the plant hoppers. So here's an example, a little miniature Serengeti where the predator was missing because of something we were doing. And the absence of that predator was causing problems. I'll give you another example on a lot bigger scale. So I said every place is a Serengeti. Let's go back to a place I've been a number of times, Yellowstone National Park in the American West. The sort of iconic plant in the American West is the aspen tree. Here it is in the fall, showing its fall colors. But biologists started to notice there was something really strange about the aspen in Yellowstone. And what was strange was that, this is in the mid-1990s or so, they're all pretty much very old. If you looked at how old the different aspen were, it turns out that sort of younger aspen were just plain missing from the park. They were pretty scarce. So that meant that most of the aspen were pretty old. That meant that they were more vulnerable to disease, more vulnerable to being blown over in storms and things like this. So Yellowstone was losing its aspen, as were other parts of the American West. Now, why might this be happening? Well, I'll give you a picture that might be a hint. Okay, so here's a biologist, Bob Ripple, who worked on this, standing in a field in front of some aspen, and you can see that that bark is chewed up to perhaps 10 feet or more high on all of those trees. And the only creature that can chew that high on bark is elk. So the suspected culprit of what was causing the aspen problem was that the elk were really chewing down the aspen. But why would that be happening? Why would that be happening, for decades in Yellowstone? Well, now that you know something about the Serengeti rules, if the elk are grazing on these plants and being allowed to do that freely, maybe that's the problem. And why would that be happening? Maybe there's a predator missing. Oh, sorry, I'm going to give it to you.
Maybe because there was no other food for them to eat?
Well, that's right, and they like this bark. It's something they really like to eat. But why would there be so many elk? And the suspicion was that something was missing. And what was missing from Yellowstone? Well, we got to go to historical records. And you can always shout these out or mumble them. It's fine with me. This is an audience participation. Yeah, here we go. Wolves, exactly. Okay. The wolves were exterminated from Yellowstone in the 1920s, something that happened across most of North America. So maybe the problem was, just like on those rice plants, we were missing the big predator in Yellowstone that controlled the number of elk. Well, if that was right, I wonder what would happen if you put wolves back into Yellowstone. Now, there's a pretty big experiment. It took 20 years of debate before it happened, but it happened in 1995. Here's the first wolf coming back into Yellowstone, imported from Canada. There's a lot of dignitaries carrying that poor wolf. Okay, so what happened? What happened? So I'm going to show you a little data about what we know, and this is really an ongoing experiment. So what do we know? Well, the wolves, a good number of wolves were introduced, and they sort of established themselves and sort of bounced around in number in Yellowstone. But there's been a pretty steady pattern of decrease in the elk in Yellowstone. Okay, reduced by more than half. Okay, so maybe that would be a good prediction. More, if you got wolves in there, if a predator in there, they're going to eat their favorite food, and they're going to eat elk. Okay, what happened? What else happened in the park? Well, let's look at what happened to browsing on aspen. Drops dramatically. What happens to aspen height? Increases dramatically. So yeah, this is what's happening. You put a predator in, and the trees are now growing. Okay, that's the insight of a trophic cascade. That's what still shocks people, that a presence of a predator influences what plants grow in a place. And not just, as it turns out, aspen. As people looked around the park, look at willow. So this is a picture taken from the same vantage point in Yellowstone before the wolves were reintroduced, and now after. This is all willow growing in the foreground, and willow is not only a favorite food for things like beavers, it's what they make their dams out of. So when beavers see these willows, they start making more beaver dams, and there's a lot more beaver colonies in Yellowstone now than were there before wolves were reintroduced. So who would think that if you put wolves back into Yellowstone, you'd have more beavers? Crazy, right? Welcome to biology. Welcome to the Serengeti rules, okay? So willows rebound and cottonwood rebound along the stream beds. So reintroducing wolves has had a dramatic effect on the trees and vegetation in Yellowstone. And then with beavers building dams, with willows there, bird life is changing. The coyote patterns are changing. All sorts of other animals are changing due to the presence of this keystone predator, the wolves. Okay. Now, the other thing that I'd like you to take home tonight, partly shown by this Yellowstone story, is nature rebounding. This was measurable on a scale of a decade or less. We're now 2 decades into the experiment. But it's not the only time we've seen a dramatic effect. And the effect that's really stunning, and it's the last Serengeti rule of the night, is that nature is incredibly resilient. And what I mean by that is that given a chance, that might mean provided a proper habitat, some protection from us, time, populations can rebound dramatically. Let me give you a handful of other examples that we know from other protected species. Here's a handful from across, say, the last century. In the late 1800s, we got down to as few as 20 elephant seals in the world. There's 200,000 northern elephant seals today. Sea otters were almost exterminated by the fur trade by 1911, down to about 1,000 animals. There are over 100,000 today. By the way, sea otters are keystone species in the coastal communities of the Pacific Ocean. They're responsible for the growth of kelp forests in the same way that wills influence aspen. You can see northern Pacific humpback whales come back about 12-fold, bald eagles back about 20-fold from low numbers in the late 1960s, and wolf populations, not just by introduced to Yellowstone, but as they've spread across northern America, are thriving in many areas. But look at that, 1,000-fold recovery, 10,000-fold recovery on the scale of perhaps a century, but even dramatic discovery on the course of just a few decades. Nature is resilient. But these are individual species that were protected because of, for example, Endangered Species Act. Yellowstone, it took a lot of work to put just a small number of wolves into Yellowstone. That's manipulating single species. What happens when a system is in really bad shape and you're not just missing one predator or one species? And I want to finish tonight by telling you about a really important story going on in the world. And it involves a park in central Mozambique in southeastern Africa called Gorongosa National Park. Now, Gorongosa in the 1960s was a tourist destination, especially for sort of the jet setters, kind of the Hollywood types, because it had a massive concentration of lion and elephants and buffalo and hippos, the things that tourists like to see, kind of concentrated, especially along this lake that's right in the center of the park. The little map I'm showing you here on the right is showing you this lake is sort of the central feature of the park. And here's a little footage from those days. I don't have the 1963 soundtrack, which I think would have been pretty snazzy. But you can see tourists riding around in VW buses, lions just kind of lounging near the wildebeest and playing around. There were about 500 lions in Gorongosa National Park. And here comes the terrible side of the story. After after Mozambique's independence from Portugal, a civil war broke out in Mozambique, lasted almost 2 decades, killed 1 million people, displaced 5 million more, and unfortunately Gorongosa was about the geographic center of that civil war. And in addition to being shot for food, a lot of the wildlife was shot, for example, poached and sold for body parts like ivory and things like that, and all of the buildings in the park were destroyed. This is what Gorongosa looked like at the end of the Civil War in the late 1990s. That's what the tourist buses looked like, shot full of holes, all the buildings bombed out. As for the wildlife, it's a little complicated graph to look at because the effects were so dramatic. So if you look up here, before the war, in 1972, there were 14,000 buffalo were counted in Gorongosa. That was reduced to fewer than 50 at the end of the war. Elephant, again, from 2,500 down to perhaps 100. Hippo from 3,000 or so down to 50. You can see the same sort of pattern in all sorts of animals. Lion completely disappeared. Pretty bad story, pretty bad situation. Until the early 2000s, when an American philanthropist named Greg Carr learned about Mozambique, learned about Gorongosa, and thought, you know, every other country in southern Africa has a tourist industry, but Mozambique has lost theirs. That could be an important economic development engine for Mozambique to make its way back after 3 decades of horror. And so Greg Carr signed a joint management agreement with the Mozambique government to help to try to restore Gorongosa National Park, starting in 2004. He committed his own personal funds. He invited in scientists from around the world, and he really started from scratch, building the first building, restoring buildings and reestablishing the park. And I was fortunate enough to go there in the summer of 2015. So here's the last home movie of the night. So you'll forgive me the jitteriness, but I was hanging out of a helicopter with a handy cam, which I don't do as a profession. So here's a flight over the lake. You can see that central feature of the lake. Now the habitat is there in Gorongosa. And what happens is during the wet season, the rains come down, sort of the lake expands enormously in area, a lot of nutritious silt comes down and really fertilizes this valley like a salad bowl. And the animals come out to graze on it. And the animals, kids, that you can see running around there are called water buck. You can see some birds taking flight as well. And you can see little sort of rivulets and creeks that connect some of the waterways out in this massive plain in the center of Gorongosa. Now we're going to fly on a little bit more where the water widens a little bit and see who can pick out and identify these little black dots that are there in the river. There you go. You want to count those hippos? You got about 10 seconds. Okay? That's a lot of hippo. In fact, what do you think? How many? 50? 60? Okay. It's a lot of hippo. And I'm glad I'm in a helicopter, because if you're ever that really close to 60 hippo, you can smell them a good distance away. But this is all, of course, good news for Gorongosa. There's a big pod of hippos. You can see some other single hippos swimming here through the river. In just a minute, I'm going to be down on the ground in a second and near another water hole in Gorongosa. We're going to look at another species in Gorongosa. Here we go. All right. You can let that awe out as loud as you like. I kind of live for that. It's the same feeling I had. So not only is this group of elephants, enjoying that water hole. Sorry, it just disappeared quickly. But if you look quickly, there are a lot of youngsters in that group. Maybe half the elephants were juveniles. So what's going on with wildlife in Gorongosa? 11 years into the restoration project. Okay. How have the large animal populations changed? In 2000, when you added up all the animals I talked about, elephants, hippos, antelope, buffalo, etc., there were fewer than 1,000 animals combined. Fewer than 1,000 large animals combined. Today, 71,000. Nature is resilient. Greg Carr imported maybe about 300 animals, a couple hundred buffalo, some zebra, some elephants, some hippos. This is largely the rebound of animals that were already there and animals that once the fighting disappeared, migrated in from other parts of Mozambique. So now, as I showed you from the helicopter, you can see animals all over Gorongosa. In fact, this is working so well in Gorongosa that the vision has changed. The question 10 years ago was, is it possible for Gorongosa to come back at all? And Greg Carr was told he was wasting his time and his money. Gorongosa was dead. Well, that was wrong. Now the vision has changed to, maybe this will work elsewhere in the country. Maybe we can make an even bigger reserve for these animals. And so the future of Gorongosa is actually to get a lot bigger. It's a plan that's unfolding right now to expand the whole area about 8-fold. So this is the boundaries of the park. But the future plan is to expand the conservation area all the way to the Zambezi River and to the Indian Ocean, picking up some already existing reserves and some hunting concessions. There'll be people living here just as they live in the Serengeti conservation area. But forestry will be controlled, farming will be controlled and monitored to be done in a way where humans and animals can share the land. That 8-fold expansion, by the way, would make Gorongosa essentially the same size as the Serengeti, which includes parts of Kenya, parts of northern Tanzania, the Ngorongoro crater, a vast area. Okay? This is not the direction that most parks are going in the world, expanding back out from what they used to be. And they think that an expanded Gorongosa could carry about 10,000 elephants and about 500 lions. So, guess is this is perhaps going to take the next 25 or 30 years, and if you ask Greg Carr, he'd say that is exactly how he's going to spend the rest of his life. He's on the ground in Gorongosa about 6 months out of the year, directing and managing the project. So the future of Gorongosa looks a lot more promising. What about the Serengeti itself? Well, I am happy to report from home video, I lied, that I have one more for you, that the only roads through the Serengeti remain unpaved, and let's keep them that way. Thank you for listening.
Why do we not have any really big mammalian predators? You know, a predator the size of a wildebeest, for example.